It is enough to make one gasp. New U.S.-backed plans to set up a 30,000-strong, quote, so-called border force inside Syria to protect territory held by Washington's mainly Kurdish allies. We ask, are these Kurdish allies, or are there also terrorists that the U.S. is backing under the guise of Kurdish fighters? In this edition of the debate, we will discuss this move by the U.S. from all angles, like from Turkey, who has blasted the U.S. and said that it will attack the Kurdish fighters no matter what within days. Well, let's get some idea about how the Syrian side feels about this. A correspondent from Damascus, Mohammed Ali, joins us right now. Mohammed, more about the government reaction, if you can, and what they intend to do about this.
Yes, the Syrian government, particularly the foreign ministry, issued a statement expressing the Syrian government's strong condemnation of the U.S. announcement on forming this armed militia northeast of Syria, adding that it represents, this U.S. decision represents actually a blatant aggression on Syria's sovereignty, security, and of course unity. It also said that this decision is in violation of international law. Also, the statement of the foreign ministry said that this decision comes in the framework of the U.S. destructive policy in the region that aims to fragment countries, increase tensions, and also block any solution for its crises. The foreign ministry said that the Syrian government will regard every Syrian citizen that takes part in this militia as a traitor that betrayed the Syrian people and country. But the most important part of the statement is actually when it said that the Syrian army and people are determined to put an end to any form of U.S. presence in Syria, its agents and its tools. And here, of course, we have to note that there are several U.S. bases across the country. For example, there is a U.S. presence in El Tenf and also in the northern part of Syria near the borders with Turkey. And of course, when the Syrian statement says agents and tools, we're speaking here about the so-called Syria's Democratic Forces, mostly made up of the YPG, or also known as the People's Protection Unit. So this is actually a strong statement. The first time we hear that the Syrian government saying such a strong statement that it will end any form of U.S. presence in Syria.
Thank you for that. We appreciate it. Of course, Monitor Mohammed Ali from Syria's capital, Damascus. Let me introduce our guests for this edition of the debate. First, journalist and political commentator Hafsa Mustafa joins us from London. Welcome. So, 30,000 strong, as they want to call it, force on the border there, Hafsa Mustafa. At this point, they only have 230. Initially, what's your reaction to this?
Well, it's a blatant violation of Syrian sovereignty. You don't impose anyone or any fraction on the borders of any country. I think the US or Britain or any other country would be profoundly opposed to such a move, and it's particularly disturbing when it comes in a very volatile region such as the Middle East. So it's a violation of Syrian sovereignty, and it's unacceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable to the Syrian government, and I strongly hope that the international community will see sense and will stop any of these moves. It has to be noted that the Kurdish organizations, various Kurdish movements across the Middle East, have been used as stooges to fight the legitimate governments of the region, and they have been played by various fractions, be it Western governments or left-wing organizations who have been playing white savior with the Kurdish groups, claiming to somehow support their movements for independence, whilst in fact impacting the sovereignty of various nations. Now, it is slightly amusing to see Turkey react. There is a sense of almost poetic justice in this for Turkey, which played a very destructive role in Syria and in impacting Syria's sovereignty. So there is somehow something amusing to watch the Turkish reaction. But in effect, at the very least, getting Erdogan on board in fighting this intrusion is important, and at least it shows that the original plan to support the destruction and the evisceration of Syria and the removal of its legitimate government was wrong. The alliances that Turkey made at the time were wrong, and here is the result.
Okay, so you talk about Turkey. Well, tell us what role exactly is Turkey playing here? And I'm asking this in this form and manner because we had one analyst that indicated what we are seeing from Turkey as a reaction is just for show. that behind the scenes, Turkey is actually very much obedient to the U.S., and one of the reasons he cited for that is that Turkey is a NATO member. But then again, you have the Kurdish factor here.
I don't think Turkey will look at this in a positive way. I think this is very much strengthening the Turkish separatists within Turkey, and that is a big no-no for any president or for any government in Turkey, be it the Islamists or being the military side. So there's no way any Turkish government would look at the sort of strengthening of Turkish organizations, regardless of their obedience, as a good thing. And I think this is an opportunity for Erdogan to actually see that alliances with imperialist nations, with warmongering nations, never result in anything positive in the Middle East. Now, of course, it is problematic for Erdogan because he's constantly having to sort of play a balancing game. He is a NATO member, yet he does claim, he seems to want to claim to have some sort of major role as an Islamic leader. So all these different roles are actually competing with each other. And of course, in his role in Syria, he very much played the pro-Western card, which is to aid and support the destruction of a fellow Muslim country, and of course a major Arab country in the region, thinking that the government was going to collapse. The government hasn't collapsed. Syria has been fighting very strong for the past 7 years, and so in retaliation to its standing up to major Western powers, the Americans are now strengthening the Kurds in order to fracture the Syrian Republic, the Syrian Arab Republic. And this is the moment where Erdogan is actually realizing that some of the politics he carried out a few years ago are going to have consequences inside Turkey.
Do you think that what the U.S. is doing here is actually even going to take off? As I mentioned, there's 230 of these so-called members that they have that's been trained. But if you remember, the CIA had this training program of which $500 million bucks was spent on it. And what came out of that was only five trained fighters. The rest, they just did not pan out. Most of them turned out to be these terrorists who were playing a double game. And that's another key question. Is this going to comprise only of Kurdish fighters? But even the success initially, do you think that that'll happen?
I think it depends of how willing the Americans are to sort of go and support this move. If there is strong reaction from regional countries, from other Western countries, I think they may slow down and realize that this is not going to be very good in the long term. But of course, if they realize that it's a good move, then I think that they will put sufficient money into it in order to sell it to public opinion, to international public opinion, and goad various Kurdish organizations and the Kurdish diaspora to support this move. If they do that, then they will eventually have the mainstream media on board, they will have various left-wing organizations on board, and that will make recruitment far easier, and that will make this move feasible. Now, of course, that only depends on whether they do have support or strong opposition to this decision. And I think these coming days are going to be crucial, because of course if Erdogan stamps his hat on the table and says no, and of course Erdogan is an important NATO player for Western countries, then maybe America is going to reconsider. But if he doesn't, and if all other countries simply talk but do not oppose it sufficiently fiercely, then I suspect the Americans will put enough money and enough effort to make sure that this materializes and becomes what they've initially announced they would want to create.
Let's bring in Chairman of the Conservative Arab Network, Wafiq Mustafa, who also joins us from London to share with us his thoughts on this. So, here you have this announcement by the U.S., 30,000 so-called border force. And tell us what you think, especially regarding the timing. Well, Wafiq Mustafa.
I think sending force of 30,000 is not going to stabilize the Middle East. If anything, it may cause more disruptions or more problems in an already divided region. Particularly, Turkey will be extremely unhappy, uncomfortable about such, even endanger the existence of NATO, So I think it is going to be a big, big problem for the Syria, for Iran, for the Middle East in general, because it means taking sides and creating somehow a Kurdish state, carving state from the back door. I'm not sure the United States will go ahead with such a big, big move. I think it's taking a huge risk, and it's a big surprise for me.
Let's break down at least some of the parties that are involved in this war, Hafsakar Mustafa, and one of them is obviously Russia that we need to talk about. And come in with Russia on what they had said recently, that they said terrorists, including those with the Takfiri-Daesh terror group, are receiving training in U.S. bases in Syria. And Russia added that these terrorists have been instructed to destabilize Syria. So Russia is saying this, and then the United States makes this announcement. So if you put two and two together, you would think that there's going to be terrorists in this group that the U.S. is making an announcement on.
Well, there's never been a problem for the US to support terrorist organizations. We know that they've supported Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. We know that they've financed al-Qaeda for many years, and we know that they continue to accidentally, regularly drop arms and supplies in ISIS-held strongholds. So there's nothing surprising in the US supporting terrorism. I would have to add, though, that Russia sort of sometimes plays a duplicitous game, because a couple of years ago they did suggest that Syria dropped the word Arab in order to appease to all the various fractions within Syria, so as not to lead down this road. And I think this was an attack on Syria's sovereignty. And of course now it does realize that this game is dangerous, because of course it has its various republics that require independence, and they could be strengthened by any move that would see Russia support Kurdish separatists, when you have various republics within Russia that could make similar claims. So Russia also has to play a balancing game. But I think we also have to look at this through the fact that there is a desire to see the Middle East strongly fragmented. Now, if we look at the Syrian conflict, it was triggered by sort of a fake Sunni-Shia conflict designed to fracture Syria. We're seeing now Kurds versus Arabs. We see elsewhere Arabs versus Berber. There are major power players here looking to fragment the region as much as possible. And of course, when this part of the world is completely broken down to its most tribal, most fragmented sections, if you want, it's going to be difficult to have strong nations that can stand up to imperialism. And this is why it's very important to support this tribalism and sectarianism that is ruining the region.
Wafik Mustafa, if the numbers pan out to what the announcement is, which is up to 30,000, do you think that we are ultimately looking at a severe confrontation that is going to take place between these forces and the Syrian army, which is obviously supported by Russia, and Iran is there in a military advisory role?
I think not the confrontation with the Syrian army, because Syrian army will be American power. I think the biggest hurdle and the biggest problem is that dragging a confrontation between Russia and United States in Syria. And that is why what I would think the Assad regime has been trying for a long time to create an environment for confrontation between Russia.
Okay, looks like we're having problems with you there, Wafik Mustafa. Hafsakar Mustafa, the same question to you. I mean, if they're amassing this type of force, aside from the fact that they're financing and training these forces, I'm assuming that they want to use it. So doesn't that spell a confrontation militarily between these forces and, I'm guessing, well, the forces from Syria, along with Russia?
So, sorry, between which forces? I missed that.
Well, the ones that the U.S. has announced, which is the Kurdish fighters, along with whatever forces they have there in that group and in that camp that's supposed to get up to 30,000, and of course then the Syrian Arab army and Russia and its military role in that country.
Oh, well, I think, I mean, this is a clash that's going to be have profound impacts on the region and obviously impact the civilian population, because the war theatre is going to be Syria. So again, this is a move that not only is designed to impact Syria's sovereignty, but also weaken its recovery. We've seen that the Syrian Arab army has made tremendous gains and has sort of been victorious against ISIS. And so this is a way to bring in new elements in order to stall the progress that was made by Syria in the past few weeks. And of course, this is designed to perpetuate the war. Now, the longer the war, the more difficult it's going to be for Syria and the region to recover. And the longer it's going to be for the region to recover, the greater impact it will have on the wider Middle East and North African region.
Or maybe there's a plan here for the partitioning. They have talked about partitioning Syria, and maybe they want just this area to themselves, and perhaps then have the dual purpose of overlooking what is going on in Syria when it comes to activities by, let's say, Russia, and of course for them to oversee what they claim to be Iranian influence in Syria.
Well, of course, I think the end game here is very much the partitioning of Syria and, again, the fragmentation of the entire Middle East. The smaller you are, the more tribal you are focused, the less you're likely to forge a strong nation. And the sort of sense of nationhood is completely eroded. So people are no longer being proud, patriotic Syrians or Lebanese or whatever. They're going to be reduced to their very basic tribalist instinct, and therefore they will be busy fighting and fighting amongst themselves. And of course, the more the region is plunged into war, the better it's easier to control. The more arms it's going to be, the bigger arms market it becomes, and it's very much a win-win for imperialist nations who have been slowly destroying and eviscerating this part of the world for the best part of 90 years now.
And what about the fact that there was this movement being made in Vienna regarding the talks, which fell apart, unfortunately, in many respects? I mean, is there any notion of a political push that is going to come from the U.S. side?
No, and there's never any desire to push for any political solution, because as we've seen this, and not only in Syria, if you'll recall at the beginning of the conflict in Libya, when Gaddafi offered on numerous occasions to negotiate in order to avoid Libya plunging into civil war, that was rejected outright, and instead within 3 weeks of protests in Benghazi, you had NATO planes pounding Libya and destroying the Libyan country and turning it into the failed state that we see today. The same scenario happened with Syria. You had Bashar al-Assad constantly offering to sit around the table and find a political solution to what was then a burgeoning conflict, and instead the opposition, which flew out to Geneva, flew out to Paris in order to be supported and funded by Western government, preferred instead to go down the route of war than actually negotiate a smooth transition perhaps of power, and therefore avoid completely war. So what we've seen so far is the rejection, the complete rejection of any political situation in favor of ongoing conflict. And again, this is what this Kurdish move is actually telling us. Because Syria, the Syrian Arab army, has actually managed to defeat ISIS, what we're doing to them now is bringing in a new enemy, arming new terrorists and telling them to fight and weaken Syria. And if it's not the Kurds, there'll be something else coming up, propping up again, in order to destroy and in order to weaken not only Syria, but like I said, the entire region.
And let's bring in Wafik Mustafa back into the conversation. Wafik Mustafa, one entity we have not spoken about here is Israel. And how do you see the Israeli factor in all of this?
Well, it's confusion, because Israel, of course, will have its own interest in what's happening. I think it is just, in the English way, it disturbs the apple cart of things in the Middle East and in Syria. I would have left things alone, but the American change is really going to upset the situation, and particularly regarding to countries which are quite boisterous about it, like Erdogan of Turkey is quite against it. And I know some people will think they will win by American interference, but I think they'll all be losers at the end.
Well, Hafsakar Mustafa, Turkey has come out and said that they're going to attack these Kurdish fighters in a matter of days. Do you think that that's a bluff?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think that's a bluff. I think
Hafsakar
anything
Mustafa,
Kurdish is a red line when it comes. Sorry, anything when it comes to Kurdish separatist groups and their supporters is a red line for the Turkish government, and therefore they're not going to allow this to happen, and they will put their full weight behind resistance to this move. And like I said, I think at this point in time, it really is in the hands of Erdogan, because it really depends of how forceful his reaction is going to be to this. If he doesn't react within the next few days, either verbally, diplomatically, or indeed even militarily, then it will strengthen Kurdish separatists, and I think that may strongly impact Turkey within, I mean, the Turkish government and Turkey itself. So he has all interest in reacting and putting a stop to this as soon as possible. If he doesn't, I mean, and I doubt he won't, I think this will encourage this Kurdish movement to grow. And I think it really is the beginning of something very, very sinister that's going to develop within the next few weeks and the next few months.
And final question to you in 30 seconds, Wafsa. Can you tell us if this is going to prevent any type of political transition that was supposedly on the horizon, given the fact that Syria had defeated these Daesh terrorists for the most part? 30 seconds, please.
Is for me?
Yes.
Oh, I think it's going to be a big problem. I'm not sure if President Trump has got the sanction from the Congress or not. United Nations could play a role. I think it's complicated, the Middle East. You don't know who's the enemy and who's a friend at this stage.
Thank you. Journalist and political commentator Hafsakar Mustafa from London, and chairman of the conservative Arab network, Wafik Mustafa, there, also from London. And thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitawa, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. It's goodbye.